What's up, you all? What's up, you all? Welcome to the Left-Handed Leftist podcast. As always, my name is Carlos. I am your host here. And you all, we have a wonderful, wonderful episode this week, kicking off Black History Month. So we're going to be highlighting Black activists, but also organizations that are fighting for the rights of Black people across the country. And you all, with that, I'm so happy to talk about our first podcast this month, which is going to be about voting rights, and not just your everyday voting rights. We're going to be talking about the Maryland Voting Rights Act. We're going to be talking about voting rights for incarcerated people. We're going to talk about elections, and we're going to talk generally about the Maryland General Assemblies. And I'm so excited to be talking today with Joanne Antoine. She is the executive director of Common Cause Maryland, and she just brings a wealth of knowledge when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to making sure that everyone not just has the right to vote, but also election protection and so much more. And I also want to highlight you all, please, if there's anything at any point that you like within this episode, please like, share, comment. Remember to rate us 5 stars on any podcast app that you use, as well as hit that notifications bell. And with that, you all, let's get into the episode. What's up?
Hey,
Joanne, it's so good to have you here all the way
I'm happy
from
to be
Common
on.
Cause, Maryland. How's it going?
Yes, I am good. I'm happy to be on. There is not enough independent media here in the state. Like, they're either run by special interests, or the few we have, right? They ain't got enough resources to cover statewide. So I am just happy that you created a platform like this, and that you could, talk about things through the advocacy lens, right? Say things that maybe other media outlets can't. So I'm excited to be on.
Thank you, and I'm always glad to have you here and just have conversation with you. Because,
Hmm.
and for the viewers who don't know, I have known Joanne for, oh my gosh, what, a few years now, going on like three or 4 years now.
Yeah.
Even back when I worked at
Public
one of my
citizen.
previous jobs, Public Citizen, doing election reform advocacy. You definitely
Yeah.
are a help because you know all about that, and I'm sitting here lost sometimes. Like, Joanne, what's going on?
Yes, yes.
So this is going to be
No, but you
incredible.
were like our eyes and ears in Charles County too. I think that was like some of our gaps. So yeah, it's been fun working with you.
Look at us, full circling all the way back here.
Hmm.
Actually, before we get into voting rights and everything with that, I want to first just kind of ask you, since, hey, session is about to start and then you have a whole bunch of different seats, speakership and everything. I want to know, from the advocacy side as executive director of Common Cause, how are you looking at this coming session with the new speakership, new committee seats, things like that?
It's been a lot of shuffling. I'm not gonna lie. In the House of Delegates specifically, like, all of my bills are now in a completely brand new committee and so forth. I'm calling it Glee, or partners call it Lego. But I think a lot of us are coming in really hopeful, right? Obviously, we are grateful to Speaker Jones and the leadership that she had and the reforms that she was able to pass. Even when you look at our bills, we wouldn't have voting processes inside correctional facilities if it weren't for her leadership, right? So, I think Speaker Pena Melnick, I'm hoping that she is going to build on that, right? And I think I'm excited because we've got our first Afro Latina, someone who is an immigrant, someone who I know at the local level has supported some fairly progressive reform. So it feels like a bit of a reset, right? And we know that during an election year, also, folks don't like to say it, but we know that very few things are going to move, but the things that do are going to be, the reforms that appeal to voters the most, right? But I'm hoping that she prioritizes, one, things that respond to the federal climate, which I'm sure is a priority for everyone. And two, right, that moves us towards truly more people centered, policy making, right, which isn't always the case. Yeah. So I'm
No, no.
optimistic. There you go. And my new
Awesome.
committee, I'm just praying Chair Wells, and so forth, that they are willing to embrace a lot of the reforms that we're hoping to push over the next few years.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What is this new committee? I never heard of
Ooh,
Lego.
Glee, I'm calling
Glee.
it. Government, Labor, and Elections Committee. So what they did was they removed elections and all that from Ways and Means, and she split up Health and Government Operations. So now we have a standalone health committee. All the government operation stuff has moved into this one. So it's chaired by Delegate Wells from Baltimore City, and Vice Chair Kerr, who I'm not as familiar with, but I believe is from Frederick County. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of, at least for us, we're going to live in that committee now because things like ethics and transparency and all that also go through there. But labor, I think things having to do with corrections are also in that committee. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I know when I'm following you all's legislation, I will be in that committee with you, like, oh my gosh, okay,
Yes.
and seeing what's going on. So
Yes.
with that, let's go ahead and get into it first. I know the main thing that we're here to talk about is the Maryland Voting Rights Act. I wanted, if you know, can you just give us like a top level? What is the Maryland VRA?
Yeah, I'm gonna try and give it in the shortest way possible, but I'm sure that many are aware that we have the Federal Rights Act of 1965, right? This is where Black Americans literally lobbied, died, right, to put protections in place that ensured that Black voters, that we had the same political power, right, and that we weren't being disenfranchised. And unfortunately, what we've seen at the federal level, even before Trump, we were already gutting provisions that were necessary within the VRA. But I would say under this administration and based on the blueprint that they outlined in Project 2025, I think now Project 2026, their goal is to use tactics that ensure that Black and brown voters are being disenfranchised. So what we're trying to do is insulate Maryland, right? What we want is, they're going to take away the protection at the federal level. Fine, we're going to put them in place here in the state and build on that, right? So that means everything from the translation requirements, especially a state as diverse as ours, making sure that we go beyond the threshold that was already there and expand it to languages like Amharic and so forth. But looking at things like vote dilution, voter intimidation and suppression, where we really don't have any process in place for holding, those individuals accountable, right? So really putting whatever protections we can in place because in this climate, in our proximity to DC also, I would say that we are kind of like an easy target.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess playing devil's advocate here, one of the big things is that a lot of people look and say, okay, Maryland's a Democratic state, we're deep blue.
Mhm.
And they think of, okay, we shouldn't be having any of these like problems when it comes to voting or voting
Mhm.
rights in general. And some people may look and say, well, we have like the Federal Voting Rights Act
Mhm.
and everyone is allowed to vote. And they kind of say like we shouldn't have intimidation.
Mhm.
Can you kind of talk about what are like some of the misnomers that people think to say we don't need the VRA, but
Yep.
why we actually do need it instead?
Yeah. And, we've actually had this bill introduced now. I think this is the fourth year, right? Different iterations. We split it up, then we had a big omnibus and so forth. But, legislators, when they heard about the bill and looked through it, that was actually their response, right? Maryland, we're blue. We have really accessible elections. We've managed to make a lot of progress. And they are right? Maryland is not like an Alabama, right? Or Texas, right? You have multiple options for voting, multiple days. You can register to vote up until election day. But that doesn't mean that Maryland, just as other states, are not vulnerable right now. And I would also say in our election processes, there's a lot of gaps, right? Again, we've talked about voting rights for incarcerated citizens. We've talked about some of the barriers that voters with disabilities and so forth face, right? So, we still had a lot of improvements to make, but I think, what people don't realize, I always say blue, depending on who, because I don't think we're as blue as people think. It took us 10 years to pass a reform like same date registration, right? That is a no brainer. And you would think in our General Assembly that something like that would move fairly quickly. And it did not. It took a ton of organizing, indivisibles, and so forth jumping in. I always tell national groups, they come in and Maryland, we just gonna pass this thing. And I think they've had this rude awakening where even on elections, right, things that feel like they should be like no brainers do it. We face a lot of opposition, right? And some of it just comes down to lack of political will, nothing else, right? And I think obviously legislators are always worried about themselves and their seats and, more competitive races and so forth. But even in a blue state, it is extremely difficult for us to pass reforms that are in the best interest of voters, right? I think mail-in voting is a great example where we wouldn't have made it this far, unfortunately, if it weren't for the pandemic.
Yeah, it's sad. It is sad kind of noticing that in not just Maryland, but like nationally, a lot of the things that we got from the pandemic are things that either it's surprising that no one even had this thought before the pandemic, or that after it was declared over, because technically it never really ended. We still have COVID cases now. That you think, okay, so when are these things coming back? Like I never thought I would be using mail-in voting until the pandemic. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing that from now on. You're telling me I can skip the line and I don't have to stand there and get accosted by
Yeah,
everyone running for office. I'm like, oh, vote for me. No real
yeah,
platform, but that's a whole separate
yeah.
argument. Uh
Yeah, I mean, if it weren't for the pandemic, we wouldn't even be hopefully we would have made it there now, but what folks don't remember is like we weren't streaming, committee meetings and votes and we were still listening to audio for the floor in the Senate and the House, right? And thankfully Speaker Jones had started to follow through on the commitments that were made. I think that chamber was the first to test out streaming the floor, but the pandemic forced them to adopt technology that was already in place, right? Like the individual who lives on the Eastern Shore should not have to drive forever to drop off testimony first and to sit there for hours to wait to testify for 2 minutes. And that's what was happening. And the pandemic, while as horrible as it was, to your point, forced them to adopt things like accessible government proceedings and mail-in voting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a good and bad thing with the pandemic. Some of it good, some of it like, look, I'll let's not do that again.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned one of the parts about incarcerated people, because as you know, there's a lot of people who have that first notion of, oh, once you're incarcerated, you cannot have the right to vote at all, even when you get out. And we've seen
Hmm.
laws change to be able to allow people once they get out to be able to register to vote in certain circumstances. Can you tell us about what you all are doing at Common Cause Maryland about incarcerated people's right to vote?
Yeah, we've made a lot of progress in the last few years, and I want to make sure I lift up partners like Out for Justice, Life After Release, Maryland Justice Project, who are individuals who are directly impacted, who lead those communities, and who have been instrumental in all this work, right? Like Common Cause was never lead, right? I think our role is thinking about the processes, and they're thinking about what it looks like implemented in a correctional facility. But Maryland, we've restored the right to vote for individuals who are citizens who have come back home. Thankfully, in 2021, during the pandemic, we passed a Reform Value My Vote Act that ensured that there's voting access in prisons and jail for those who are awaiting trial or who are serving time for misdemeanors. And now we're working towards restoring the right to vote for every citizen. That is regardless of the reason for incarceration, that is even for the individual that is serving a life sentence, right? I think for our organization, the position is that, the right to vote should have never been taken anyway. And, we could discuss whether or not these individuals should be incarcerated in the first place, right? That is a longer conversation, but, we could say they are being held accountable, right? They are serving their time. And, our neighbors, our friends, our family members that are in these facilities, they have interests back home, right? They should have a say in who represents them. And, I think for me, Common Cause, we don't sit in judiciary and judicial proceedings as much as our partners. And, these are committees in the House and Senate where criminal policy bills, are mostly heard. I think what was shocking to me, though, is sitting in those committees. And while our partners do a great job of organizing coalitions inside the jails and prisons and bringing in returning citizens, legislators sometimes it's almost like they forget that we are talking about actual humans, like the person that lived around the corner from you and so forth, right? So I do think restoring their voting rights will force, elected leaders to pay attention and to appeal to that base. Because we could see parts of the state. Imagine you're incarcerated for life in Hagerstown. I'm using that as an example, right? Your right to vote is restored. You could find yourself in a position where there's enough power, political power to flip a seat, right? So this is a long-term campaign and we know that, how would you say, restoring the right to vote also helps how would you say, dealing with the recidivism rates, right? It helps individuals come have a more successful reentry, hopefully more, civic activism as they come home and so forth. But I think for us, it's more you should have a say in who represents you and who the people are making decisions about you on a day to day, even inside the facility, right? And I think the only way, unfortunately, to force some of these elected leaders to listen is by, giving these people the right to vote. So they could either vote them out or, and so forth.
No, you're
But a
right.
big, big initiative.
No, you're right. Oh, that's wonderful. And because a lot of times, and even I've sat on and heard different like lobby meeting stories about this legislation with certain legislators. I'm not going to get into it, name them at this moment, but even them having the kind of thought process of, well, they're incarcerated. What do they need to vote for? And I'm
Yeah.
glad that you mentioned it, because if you are incarcerated, chances are your elected officials do not care what you think. They do not care what affects you and what not.
Hmm.
And the other side of it, a lot of politicians use incarcerated peoples as almost like chess pieces to be able to like leverage their own popularity to say, hey, let me stand and say, oh no, I support incarcerating younger people, or actually not giving people process to come back home. And
Hmm.
then we'll use that to campaign on to say, vote for me. So imagine
Yep.
if those people who are incarcerated had a vote, and now you
Hmm.
as elected official, you have to go to them and say, here's why you should put me in office because I want to
Yeah.
support you, or let them say that they don't support you
Yeah.
and want to keep you incarcerated,
And
and
they
then you
want you
vote
out.
against them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's been amazing to see, right? Like in 20 or throughout the pandemic, this with ACLU and partners, we managed to visit, I think it was like 17 correctional facilities, right? So all the prisons in the state, a lot of the local jails that were willing to let us in. And I think what was shocking to me, I'll use Anne Arundel as a good example because we went to the Ordnance Road facility and, citizens were able to come to the gymnasium and work with us, different setting, right? This is where correction staff was great. But seeing, Trump was on the ballot that time. So the previous election, and it's Anne Arundel, so very different makeup inside the correctional facilities. But seeing Republicans and young Dems, right, literally sitting there, they can't agree on president, right? But when they are looking at the circuit court judges and so forth, right, actually sitting there and having detailed conversations, because they're experiencing the same thing right now. But I think on your point too about us being a blue state, right? I think this is where people forget that we may be okay on elections over here, but we still overwhelmingly incarcerate Black people, specifically Black men, I think at the highest or the second highest rate in the country. And when we look at the people who are being disenfranchised, I think Sentencing Project had put out like a short report for us last session. I think it's 16,000 people are eligible to vote right now. Over 70% of them are Black people, right? So, when you compare that to our population here in the state, we're only like 30 to
30.
35%. It's overwhelming, So again, when we're thinking about things like VRA and so forth, in a state like Maryland, the people that are being disenfranchised or facing unnecessary barriers to voting, it is, who we consider protected class, right? People who are Black and brown, people with disabilities, low income individuals that can't afford to make it way over to this vote center over here and so forth. Yeah.
No, you're right. And I mean, it's insane thinking about how we have what we are 30% of the population, but
Hmm.
70% of the
Yep.
incarcerated population, and just seeing that and seeing how there is so much tie-in between voting rights and also black rights and black justice as well, to
Hmm.
be able to say, so this is definitely something I hope is supported by the Black Caucus of Maryland as well, because it has so much um
Yeah.
symmetry between it as
Yeah.
well.
I mean, that is what we are hoping, right? Even if it's not this session, my hope is that they prioritize at the very least the Voting Rights Act. And from my understanding, there are conversations about, making sure that what I'll call good governance or democracy reforms, that they're being discussed more regularly in the caucus. But, as one of the largest Black caucuses in the country, I would assume, again, I would hope that support for Voting Rights for All Act, at least next session moving forward, that they would join that fight. Thankfully, we have great champions like Delegate Wilkins and our cross-file Senator Muse that are willing to fight with us. But I think this is where even Dems, y'all, like, might yeah, this is where a lot of advocacy is really going to be needed, right? So I think we're slowly working to build the campaign, but that is why the bill right now includes no exemptions, right? What we don't want is to open the door, to conversations around domestic violence and murder and so forth, because at that point, the legislators are going to try to exclude different populations and so forth. I think for us, non-negotiable, even the person that was found guilty of like somehow breaking voting laws and so forth, let's restore their right to vote right now too.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. That's amazing. And yeah, because I've always been of the mindset that whenever legislators say, "All right, cool, we're gonna pare this or water this bill down, and then you can come back next session." Anytime you try to come back, they always say, "Well, we just did this. Can we give it time to work?" But time to work means can we just never address this
Yep.
again at all? So I am glad to see organizations actually put their foot down and say like no, here is our line in the
Yeah.
sand, and we're not going to
Yeah.
cross it. So shout out to
Yeah.
y'all at Common Cause
No,
and Partners.
it is necessary, and I mean, that's where the power of coalition comes in too, but I think for members of the public as well, if you bring a bill, right, you found a sponsor, you need to have non-negotiables, right? If they water that bill down and it passes, it is gonna take you'd be lucky if you find another sponsor, to work with you to strengthen the bill. So, unfortunately, this is where we'll kill it if we need to, right? And we made that threat last year on language access, which was part of the VR, watered down too much, and it's like, no, you could either kill the bill or you can make some fixes. And thankfully, Delegate Wilkins and Senator Augustine, he fought like hell in the Senate to move that bill for us. So there needs to be a line because it's going to be that much more difficult for you to pass, a stronger version of the bill.
Okay. Can you kind of touch on that a little bit more? What were some of the how did they want to water down language access? Because that seems like to me one of the easiest things to say. We can all agree that anyone who
Listen,
goes to vote should be able to read what's on the ballot or be able to have it in their
listen.
native language.
That's what you would think, and I thought it was just a Maryland thing, but apparently other states run into just as many barriers too, right? And I think when we look at a state like Maryland, I'm forgetting the census data, but we are the most diverse state in the East Coast, right? And even when you break it down to municipalities, we have two of the most diverse municipalities in the country, right? So translations should be a no-brainer. Statewide, Spanish should just be the basic, threshold and so forth. And unfortunately, the bill included things like we didn't include translation of ballots. We knew that that was the one place we want that down the line, but we knew that working with the State Board of Elections, it's like, okay, we will put that aside right now. We're going to translate sample ballots instead so that individuals still have access to it. But it was related to the threshold, right? The federal VRA, I believe the threshold is 5%. So when we're looking at a place like Prince George's County, Montgomery County, those are the only two jurisdictions that have to translate to Spanish. And that's it, right? So I think for us, it was like we want to lower that threshold, ideally go to 2%. We want all materials translated. We want judge recruitment is difficult, but we want to encourage, the recruitment of judges that speak multiple languages and so forth, right? And I think some of those things they weren't really willing to include and so forth. But again, we got a strong version passed, not everything that we want, but it will be rolled out this election. So hopefully people use it. Even if you speak English, I'm going to be in there asking for a Creole, translation,
There you
Creole
go.
materials and so forth, because that is the best way to help us improve these programs as they're being implemented. But again, you're going to water down language access. You can imagine, again, the reforms that our partners are working on, even some of these enviro things that I can't keep up on, the fights that our partners are facing.
Yeah, it's been crazy. And then this is when I kind of am gonna follow up on what you started here to say, but also since I'm a separate podcaster, I'll go a little bit stronger and say that you even see, yes, we are a democratic state, a supermajority in the House and the Senate. And one thing that I've talked to different people on the podcast and off the podcast is just the difference in what you see legislators are willing to fight for when you have a Republican as the governor or a Democrat as the governor. And one thing that we've seen is under Larry Hogan, the Democrats in the House and Senate were much more forceful to say, "Hey, we are going to push for." I won't say the most progressive things,
Yeah.
but like at least better things and actually hold the line. But since we have a Democratic governor, especially a Democratic governor who has plans to be president, vice president, something,
Mhm. Yeah.
you really see kind of a willingness to say, all right, cool, but let's just kind of ease things up so that he has
Mhm.
an easier time. And even when it came down to the veto overrides,
Mhm.
one thing that you saw legislators say, oh no, I disagree with Moore for vetoing the legislation, but we are still aligned and I still want his success and things. And I feel like, why do you need to come follow it up with, I want to see his
Mhm.
success? He'll succeed or fail on his own. I want the
Yeah.
state to succeed, but that doesn't have to do with him as a person.
Yeah, and I think some of that also needs to be handled internally, within the party and so forth, right? But it's funny you say that because obviously my time at Common Cause was largely under, Governor Hogan, right? So the legislature did move quick. They strategically passed bills at a time where they could override it and so forth. And I remember some of my mentors, like Charlie Carter, and so forth, telling me, like, Joanne, you're going to have a rude awakening. I came in when he was elected thinking we're going to move everything that we know is a no-brainer. Like, we know money has to be factored, but I'm like, we about to get shit done. Without going in on the governor or anything, it was a shock to see how things slowed down, right? And I will say, legislators and so forth, they're worried about optics, right? And the party looking whole and so forth. But I think for us, you're here in those seats to pass good policy, right? And we don't care whether or not the optics are bad and so forth. You could deal with that after session, right? We take this no permanent friends, no permanent enemies thing very seriously. And I think it should be the same, for our elected leaders, right? If the governor is bad on something, he vetoed it and so forth, you come back and you fight for it, right? If anything, you proactively work with him ahead of time, to get him on board. But the public don't see it, but people told me very early on things are going to slow down. So when we talk about lack of political will, like, yes, we are in a real budget deficit, but I think we have to ask questions like why certain things, were vetoed, why certain things aren't moving. Why is it that individuals in Prince George's County are yelling, organizing, around things like data centers, in the way that they are. And a lot of that has to do with the county government, but we had an opportunity as a state also, the responsibility, I would say, specifically for the governor in this case, to have passed that bill, the study. And I think that they overrode the veto. But, everyone knows that if you're placing data centers in communities, our communities are going to be the first ones, right? So we failed our community there, and so forth. But I think that those are the types of things where, the governor needs to be held accountable, right? Saying that there's no money to conduct a study, no money to explore things like not to study the harm of reparations, but to create a blueprint for what reparations could look like in the state. I think those were bad moves,
No, you're
on
right.
his end, right? Yeah.
There's a lot of people disappointed in good old Wesley Moore.
Yeah.
So it's going to be
Yeah.
really interesting to see how this upcoming election cycle works. And I have a few more questions about kind of just not just the VRA specific, but kind of voting rights within the state. So
Hmm.
one question with the VRA is that does the legislation only affect counties? Does it also affect municipalities
Hmm.
as well, or does it also affect like delegates
Hmm.
and how they're districted out as well?
No. Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't go beyond that, but it covers counties and municipalities. I think some examples when we're thinking about Baltimore County, it just went through redistricting, right? That would be a process where the attorney general would be able to intervene and help us create more opportunity districts potentially. When we think about St. Mary's or your old home county, I think they've done away with this,
At
discriminatory at
large.
large process. But places like St. Mary's, right? Like, we have communities that are not represented at all. And is because, to break it down the most basic sense, because I want to make sure people aren't thinking like Montgomery County at large, right? I live in Moco. I have a district representative, and then there's four at large people that, represent me too. What we're speaking to is the person who lives in Charles County, who lives in District 6, and everyone, in the county is voting on who represents them in District 6, right? You can only imagine how much more difficult it is for Black and Brown people to be elected or those who are allies. And even though your vote is counted, it doesn't carry the same weight. And municipalities, there are laboratories of democracy, right? They're able to pass things that we can't, non-citizen voting and so forth. But what we want to ensure is that even with well-intentioned, reforms, that they're implemented correctly. I think of the city of Federalsburg, where ACLU had that lawsuit and just thinking, I want to say it was like over 100 years or so, like where no Black person was ever able to be elected to a seat. And now they have multiple representatives, right? So we've seen the impact that a reform like this can have, and it gives pathways, for legal challenges where necessary too. But
No, you're
counties,
definitely
municipalities, not the legislative seats or congressional seats.
okay. Okay,
Yeah.
definitely. And you're right too about the Charles County aspect. And I'll actually tell a funny story about that. So for
Mhm.
years, Charles County had been at large. So just as Joanne put it, I lived in District 3. Just because I lived in District 3, someone in District 1, 2, and 4, they can vote for who represents District 3, just like everyone can vote for it, whoever.
Mhm.
The problem with that was that back when Charles County had a minority Black population, our votes would be diluted so that
Mhm.
the people of the District 1 or 4 or 2 would overwhelmingly just vote for their preferred candidate. But I will say this, when Charles County became majority Black, you had
Mhm.
legislators push back and say we do
Yes.
not need to go by district because they're
Yes.
thinking, oh, now we have the power.
Okay.
We can just vote whoever we
Yep.
want. And it was amazing because you actually saw when it came for a state bill come
Mhm.
up that would make all code home rule counties, which Charles County is a part of, it would
Mhm.
make them all have to vote by district, even though Charles County was already moving in that direction from a
Mhm.
few legislators. You saw Charles County advocacy groups and Charles County elected officials come out in
Yeah,
opposition to the
wait,
bill because they're thinking, do
wait.
not delay our vote.
Listen, and I was shocked. Like, don't get me wrong, like local governments will take a position. We work with Maryland Associated Counties and MML, but the way that these county commissioners came bulldozing in, and it helped a lot in the House because Speaker Jones and Delegate Wilkins at that point, I think that is what moved them to pass the bill very quickly, even more. And they made Senate President Ferguson the target. And the way that they organized though, shows just how much, again, these individuals are willing to fight to do whatever possible to maintain the political power that they have, right? It's unfortunate, right? Living in a community where you don't see yourself ever reflected in the government, where you're seeing the lack of representation, being reflected in the policies or lack of policies that are moving. St. Mary's has talked to me about food deserts, and so forth. How many times the sitting commissioners are unwilling to meet with them or will make disrespectful remarks, so forth. Local governments are a whole other ball game. I would argue that we have more issues at the local level dealing
Yes.
with these counties than at the state level, right? But again, they have a lot of influence, and unfortunately, we weren't able. I think it's been like a good 5 years now or so that was a discussion. Delegate Crosby was championing it and so forth, and we're grateful for his leadership. But even there, right, they were making threats, right, to challenge him, to primary him, and to take his seat, right? So they were going to great lengths to dilute, your political power more than anything.
Yeah.
So even
Yeah.
more critical, y'all, for y'all to jump in and help.
Definitely. And I'll say this, even if you are the majority population in a county that votes at large, it goes past a person's race. It goes into your party affiliation because you look at a lot of these code homeroom counties like
Mhm.
St. Mary's, Calvert, and so forth. They are very Republican censored, and because it's set like this, and you could honestly have just a large population of Republicans living in one
Yeah.
district, they
Yeah.
can just outvote the other two districts and be able to control who
Mhm.
runs the county for 4 years.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that Democrats should get involved in, Republicans should get involved in, third
Mhm.
party members and all that.
Yep.
And as we talk about kind of third parties, everyone
Mhm.
having the right to vote, I just had Owen Silverman Andrews, who is the lieutenant governor candidate for the Green Party ticket. And one thing they're working on is legislation when it comes to the debates
Yes.
coming up. And I want to get your thoughts on if you all have looked at that legislation, basically allowing it since what is it, Maryland Public Broadcasting takes taxpayer money for their own funding, that they have to
Yeah.
open up their process for debates. So what are your thoughts when it comes to just the debate one, but the broader topic of like how Maryland is kind of oppositional to third parties to where you
Yeah.
don't it takes so much for them to petition to get onto the ballot. And then if they
Mhm.
do get that 1% threshold, you're looking at only one another election that they're
Mhm.
able to hold a ballot access.
Yeah. Yeah. Andy told me about it, and I haven't had the chance to look at. I think he may have even sent me a draft. So I haven't looked at the bill text yet. I know that they've worked in collaboration with like Leaders of Beautiful Struggle and others, but I would say just based off of like what we've, our initial conversation, it is something that we would support, right? I think, if there are individual parties being represented for that office on the ballot, that voters should hear from them as well. And you're right. Like, it's insane the bills that will go through the legislature that they're unwilling to entertain. And if people remember, during the pandemic, we had put temporary regulations in place where, we weren't outside. You didn't want to interact face to face with someone, where you were able to sign these petitions that the parties need to get on the ballot. You could do it electronically. And there's been bills like that introduced. And as you can imagine, most they don't move, right? They don't move. And it's for multiple reasons. It's not just about limiting the Green Party, for example, because they are the most organized right now, right? Limiting the influence and the representation that the Green Party could have on the ballot. It's also around things like citizens initiatives, right? People, what they don't want is for it to be easier for us to kind of, how did I call it? I called it something recently, but they passed a bad bill, and what I call citizens veto. There you go. They don't want it to be easy for us to go back and be like, nah, we didn't want this, so we're gonna undo it, and so forth, right? So when we talk about like access to our democracy and so forth, this is a good example because someone who is running as a green, someone who's running with the roses, and I'm forgetting, the other parties, they should have a seat at the table, and it should be certainly on Maryland's public TV where taxpayer dollars, are helping to fund the work that they do. Yeah, so I'd say off face value, it is something that we plan to support.
Okay, awesome,
Yeah.
awesome. That's
And
amazing.
I will
And
do
then
the plug on Andy. Like, obviously, we are nonpartisan, so we don't support any individual candidate, but he's using public financing. So I wanted to throw that out there also, because like he is running a small dollar campaign where hopefully he'll be able to be a lot more competitive when he qualifies for the matching funds. Yeah.
definitely. Did you all, as Common Cause, work on the public financing system? Can you go into that just like a little bit, as far as just like what in your opinion are the advantages to having public financing rather than the I guess former system of just, hey, raise money
Mhm.
however you raise it, as long as you meet that
Yeah.
$6,000 threshold and cut them
Yeah,
off, you're good.
I live in public financing. I so Common Cause, and currently Progressive Maryland, we run the Fair Elections campaign, where we're advocating for these public campaign financing programs at the county and at the state level. So in the most basic watered down version, what we're aiming to do is limit the impact, the influence of special interests, right? Those who can afford to just cut $6,000 checks and create IEs and so forth, and really trying to amplify the voices of voters, right? And your small dollars. Because if you're like me, I can't afford to cut. Honestly, I ain't cutting $100 to each and every one of you either. It's just not what's available to me. But I will
I'm not cutting
give you
$50.
20. Listen, I will give you $25, right? And I think it does a few things. One, it helps to create more competitive races, right? Because the person that we'd consider a non-traditional candidate, you don't have access to wealth, right? And you are a young person, you're a woman of color, and we know that it takes you a lot more times to consider even running, and the next barrier is raising money, right? We are providing you with an alternative. You don't have to go after, all these people that could cut big money. You instead can run a campaign powered by the people that you seek to represent. And I'm going to give you $5 because I know now that my $5 goes a lot further. It's going to be, I'm trying to think of one of the match systems, but my $5 is going to be matched and it's going to be 40 now. We're hopefully moving towards more representation. We see that here in MoCA where we have more women. We are creating more competitive races because you've got the resources that you need. We're creating a new base of donors. A lot of times, candidates tend to to focus on super voters, right? It's a tactic, it's a strategy, and you're going to prioritize those that have money. And what public financing does, it forces you now, because everybody, depending on the county, a lot of people are using it. You're going to have to appeal to new bases of individuals, right? So it's forcing you to go into communities that you haven't seen before. And then obviously, post Citizens United and so forth. This is a route, but we are, fighting back against the influence of big money where we can, especially at this time where billionaires honestly are the ones running the country and prioritizing their needs and their companies. This is Maryland's way of fighting back. And I think what people don't realize is we have the most robust program so far in the country. We have 7 programs. 6 of our largest counties have programs. 5 of them are in use this election cycle, and 71% of the population lives in a place with a program. So my hope is the General Assembly, that's the next goal, to create a program. And these are optional. So we don't fault candidates for running the traditional way. You want to raise money,
You don't, I
six
do.
down. You don't have to, but our hope is that, what we're seeing in Montgomery County, it's like individuals are asking candidates, are you using public financing? We're hoping we begin to see that statewide, right? Where you don't have these LLCs that are cutting multiple checks to you. Instead, we look and see a lot of residents that are donating to you instead. Yeah.
Awesome. And I will say, look, I understand you not kind of disparaging candidates who don't use public financing. I'll take that. I'll wear that crown. I will disparage a candidate for not using public financing, because if you don't use public financing, to me, it really shows that you are comfortable and happy to take campaign contributions from mega donors,
Mhm.
corporations, and things like that. And then
Yep.
one thing that you can see is that when it comes to actually being in office, you're going to
Mhm.
serve those donors first before you ever serve someone who gave
Yep.
you $25 or
Yep.
even $100. You're
Yep.
going to look at them and say, well, thank you so much.
Yep.
But when that data center or a big tech company cuts you a
Mhm.
$6,000 check, you're going to say, okay, so what community needs to
Yep.
start having data centers?
Yep.
And
Yep. Yeah, I
so
tell
it's
people all the
definitely,
time, follow the money, right? If there's a reform that you think is should be moving and all that stuff, what is going on? Go look at who donated to them. It's visit MD Chris. It's easy to navigate and so forth, but we should make it a regular thing, right? And even as you're testifying, calling folks out, you accepted APAC money and so forth, throwing out the things that we know are counter to, our interests.
yeah. And I will also put the link to the Merlin Chris system in the show notes too, so people
Hmm.
definitely go and check it out. Even I would say
Yeah.
go and check out your least favorite politician. Go and check your favorite politician too,
Yeah.
because a lot of these quote unquote progressive politicians are still taking campaign finance
Yeah.
from big developers,
Yeah.
these
The
big.
police.
Yep, they run the gamut
Yeah.
on how they're going to fund themselves and control you with their campaign contributions. So one other thing I do want to get in, because you mentioned how having public finance is definitely helping Black women, Black
Mhm.
people, other marginalized communities be able to run, actually activists and leftists be able to actually
Mhm.
run. One thing I did want to ask you about, because we've seen recently with the speaker transition, but also with the transition when Wes Moore became governor, a whole lot of people be appointed to different delegates and senator seats, because once someone gets in office, they take everyone in office with them, and then now we have a whole bunch of people getting appointed who no one voted for, who can
Yeah.
either be appointed for a 4-year term, if you're talking about when Wes Moore became governor, or to a few months when you look at the people who just got appointed to take delegate Jazz Lewis's
Atterbury.
seat, delegate Kevin Harris's seat, and
Yeah,
so forth.
Atterbury and so many. Yeah.
Yeah, and Atterbury seat too. And you're talking about people who voted for you to fulfill a whole 4-year term, but then someone gets appointed in the last like few months before the election starts, basically giving them an advantage over other candidates. Can I
Yeah.
get your thoughts on what this appointment process and just your thoughts on, is it good? Is it bad?
You trying to get me in trouble. Listen, we've been working on this thing for apparently decades, and it is the most controversial reform that we have, right? It is for some reason we can't make anyone happy, right? On the advocate side, especially community leaders, they are just like, it should be full on special elections every time there's a vacancy. And I think we'd have to work out the timeline. But for us, yes, it should be ultimately voters have the ultimate say on who is going to represent them. And then on the legislator side, it's too expensive and so forth. So we worked out this compromise. I think for us as an organization, our position first and foremost is that you all, the voters, the people that live in that district, that you are the decider and who represents you in Annapolis, right? If there's an unfortunate circumstance, something happens that, the seat is vacant, again, you should have the say and elect the person that is going to sit in that seat to represent you. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. Central committees are the ones that are making the appointment. As an organization, we don't fault anyone that has come in through the current system because it exists, right? It's just there. And we've had some great leaders. I think even in Howard County for Atterbury seat, we have the first like Latino or Mexican male who is an immigration lawyer. So great people come in. But what happens is voters don't even realize that someone else is representing them now, right? And the central committee process, we don't get involved too much in the party, and we know that there are efforts to improve it, but the central committee ultimately became a pipeline to the general assembly, right? You have individuals who strategically are running or appointed to those seats. And then from there, it's a lot of backroom dealing, right? They have these forums, candidates are making the case. A lot of times they're not considering, did this person run for this seat before? And maybe they came in third, fourth place, and they should get the appointment if they're being considered, demographic data and all that. No, it just becomes who, honestly, I don't know what happens in the back room, right? All of a sudden, it's like the chair is elected, or
Yeah.
there's, things being left at someone's door about their criminal history and so forth. It gets so messy.
Yeah.
So I think our hope is that this is the year where we pass that compromise bill, where compromise is, hey, Central Committee, you still get to be part of this process, right? You're appointing someone to temporarily serve in the seat. And voters, you get the guarantee that no one is going to come in and serve a full term without your say. It's been controversial, y'all. I think a lot of individuals feel like it's what's led to more representation in the General Assembly. And I think for me, it's like yes, we want more representation, but being Black and going through an appointment process doesn't mean that you represent my interests right now. And again, I should have had the opportunity to decide whether or not it should be you. Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
controversial.
No, no, it definitely is. I remember the conversation just around the bill hearing about how, well, you're trying to take black people out of office and all that. And I feel like one, I don't like that kind of comparison because it has the air of like black people need a special way to get into office because we
Yes,
can't run and win. And
yes.
it gets disrespectful on that.
Yeah,
But I'll also say you're 100% right when it comes to these central committees where it is people who just run for these, just hoping and praying someone either, takes their last breath, gets another
yeah,
job, or does something so
yeah.
that they can just be put in. And then the problem is too, once they're put in, then all the delegates and senators run on a slate together. So
Yes.
then
So
so
you're
then it's all this
guaranteed.
like I'm a
Yep,
shield around us. So
yep,
hey, you have to vote for
yep,
them because you're voting for us. And then
yep.
they all pull their money together
You're
and things like that.
Yeah, you're guaranteed. And so that no one gets mad when watching. I
Right.
know, again, we know that it's a pipeline, but I also acknowledge that there are central committee members who really are there because they want to do the outreach. They believe in the work of the party and so forth, right? So if that is you, you're not who we're talking about, right? And hopefully, if we don't pass this bill this year, you're someone that is considered, right? What we're talking about is like the people that have the relationships, that have the powers, the legislators in that district that are coming in and saying, hey, it needs to be Shirley, that's appointed and so forth, or the chair being the tiebreaker and deciding to vote for themselves. Those are the situations we're talking about, not you and the work that you're doing to get out the vote and so forth.
No, definitely, definitely. And I'll even share one kind of story that I was surprised when I heard about it. It was in I think it was in the Capitol Gazette about
Hmm.
how there was a when Shanika Henson got appointed to Sarah Elfreth's Senate seat, and
Hmm.
then you had Chrissy Holt who applied, who was kind of considered the favorite to win. And then the night before, there was a mysterious call from everyone's favorite governor, Governor Wes Moore, to the Central Committee, basically saying like, "Don't vote for her, for this other candidate," and magically enough, that candidate won. And this is one of the few times I've actually seen Central Committee members come out and say, "Oh yeah, it was the governor who called me, and I
Hmm.
wound up voting for the person because the governor told
Yeah.
me." So I think when people look at the central committees, one, I think until the system is changed, we need people definitely looking at these central committees as
Yeah.
as who serves on it,
Yeah.
why are they serving on it and what's their purpose, but then also calling for more public involvement when it comes to these appointments as well. I can even speak to
Mhm,
the one in Charles County. It was voters asking for, can you all hold a forum once you have
mhm.
after your like deadline of people signing up so people can at least hear
Yeah,
what these people say and give you
yeah,
all feedback. And it's no, it's we're gonna
yeah.
vote on this back room meeting. You can come if you want to, just look,
Mhm.
listen to us, do
Yeah.
our thing. And the crazy part is, and this is shout out to some of the activism I've been doing separately, is that in Charles County, we recently it is a bill that actually is going to be coming through the General Assembly this session. Hopefully,
Mhm,
if the delegates vote, if the Charles County delegation votes to move
mhm.
forward, but it would make it so that the Central Committee can no longer appoint Charles County commissioners if someone does step down. So it goes to a special election. So
That's
hopefully
good.
Charles County, thank you. So hopefully
That
Charles
is
County can move in
good.
that direction too, because
Yes, that is good, and I liked your point on the county process because it is just so different. Folks don't realize some have forums, others don't, and so forth, and I think, as individuals that maybe are engaged in the central committee or not, right? Like, I think what I've asked many times is like, "Why aren't you using the tools that are available to you?" Right? You use Van and so forth to turn out voters, so why aren't you using it to call the people in that district to tell them to come to the forum and so forth, right? So, again, even the parties, and that's all, that's the Republican Party too, not doing enough, at least in these current processes, to engage the constituents in those districts as well.
awesome, definitely. And as we close out here, I have one other question for you. What are your thoughts on the whole congressional redistricting in Maryland that was
Mm,
going on, trying to basically, from what it sounds like, and I'm gonna just like keep it honest, trying to get rid of Andy Harris's seat so that it's no longer a Republican and making it what a 8 Democrat majority here within the
Yeah.
Maryland congressional delegation.
Yeah. Not a bad question. People ask us all we're the redistricting group. Us and the League of Women Voters, we're the ones screaming for years, independent redistricting commissions and so forth. So for us, right, our position, we are still an organization that opposes gerrymandering, right? We always will be. And I think for us, we agree with legislators where there needs to be a federal fix. I think what we've done is pivoted a bit, right? And we've been criticized for this, but these are unprecedented times. They're not normal, right? And I think when we talk about our democracy, falling apart and so forth, what we're seeing happening in other states, right? Targeted efforts led by Trump to take seats from, certain, I'm trying to do it in a nonpartisan way, but to take seats, right?
Yeah.
And seats that are largely represented by people of color, or people of color make up those parties, right? So while we can't say that we support mid-decade redistricting, I'd say for now, we don't want to stand in the way if there are certain criteria that, the legislative body meets, right? So we know that Delegate Moon, we'll see what happens, on opening day and so forth. But Delegate Moon, for example, we know that he supports independent redistricting. We know that he supports a federal fix. There's other, pieces around, making sure that we are not doing away with our majority Black districts or diluting them too much, and that the process is transparent. So I think if they meet those criteria, we won't oppose. Again, they're going to do what they have to, and we understand that, again, these are unprecedented times. I think there are members of the public who feel like it's just one seat. I think it's more, when you do the math, I don't know where we are now, but the math was making sense based on what people were sharing with me. I think, outside of that, it's, I think it's a hope that we can address some of the voters' apathy. Like, apathy is how we're saying it, right? Like, we know that turnout is really low. We know that there are individuals who feel like their representatives aren't fighting for them and so forth, right? So I think it's more than just the numbers. It's also, in this case, the party conveying that we are, we're going to fight back and that this is larger than Maryland, right? This is a nationwide effort. So I say all that to say, Common Cause, we still oppose gerrymandering. But again, if the General Assembly can meet the criteria where they're doing things like protecting certain communities, calling for federal reforms, making sure the process is transparent, we will back off in hopes that we can hopefully move to a fair redistricting process in the future.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Joanne, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please, can you tell the viewers how they can keep up with you all this session with Common Cause Maryland,
Hmm.
your social media,
Yeah.
website, just how we can really just stay engaged.
Yeah, we got a lot of priorities this year, y'all. So join us or join our partner orgs too who work in coalition with us. But you can visit md.commoncause.org for more information about the organization, our local work and our state work and our priorities. You can follow us on Twitter, or not Twitter, X. Well, we're not on X anymore. Apologies. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram. I think we just created a Blue Sky account. If you search Common Cause Maryland, will pop up, right? Yeah. And yeah. So md.commoncause.org, Instagram, Facebook are probably the best places to get the latest updates from us.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Yes.
Thank you all. And thank you all so much for joining us here on the Left Handed Leftist podcast. You all, I can't wait to see you all next time. And remember, it's a podcast. So like, share, subscribe, hit the notifications bell, 5 stars, all the different things that you do to let us know that you love this here. And we'll keep it going. And we see you all next time for our full episode. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, y'all.